Hello, and welcome to this webinar on green consumption and production. My name is Jameson Irvin, and the Global Head of UNDP's Green Commodities Program. This webinar is an introduction focusing on the question of what is green consumption and production. Sustainable consumption is defined as the consumption of goods and services that have minimal impact on the environment, are socially equitable and economically viable while meeting the basic needs of humans worldwide. Sustainable consumption targets everyone across all sectors and all nations, from the individual to governments and multinational conglomerates. Sustainable consumption and production is also defined as, quote, the use of services and related products which respond to the basic needs of humans and bring a better quality of life while minimizing the use of natural resources and toxic materials, as well as the emissions of waste and pollutants over the life cycle of the service or product, so as not to jeopardize the needs of further generations. It's important to note that sustainability, climate change, biodiversity, water, food and nutrition security, right to food choices, and energy are all closely connected. We can't really address one without addressing the others. As we think about sustainable consumption and production, we should think about a few things. First, the strategies to address climate change, ensure food security, and protect biodiversity relate to how both consumers and producers act. Secondly, sustainable production involves joint work between the public sector and the private sector. This kind of cooperation is essential for sustainable production at a large scale. And finally, this webinar and the learning module on greening consumption and production is very closely aligned with Sustainable Development Goal 12 on ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. In this webinar, you'll learn a few things. First, you'll learn about why should we focus on agricultural commodities? Why is that a good place to start? Second, we'll talk about why should we focus on consumption choices and what are the impacts and causes of unsustainable production. Third, we'll talk about how we can achieve sustainable production at scale. We'll explore what we can achieve through public and private partnerships, and we'll learn about UNDP's Green Commodities Program. Let's start with a very basic question. Why focus on agricultural commodities? Well, agriculture is the bedrock of most world developing economies, contributing to economic development, food security, and poverty reduction. But we also need to be aware of the scale of the impacts of agricultural production. Let me just give you two examples. First, Indonesia is the largest producer and exporter of palm oil in the world, generating $20 billion per year and employing millions. Second, there are 25 million coffee farmers in Latin America living in poverty. The practices used by farmers have a major impact on the land under production, intensification, and expansion. Here are two examples or two facts. First, agriculture is the single largest cause of deforestation today. If we take palm oil, cocoa, coffee, soy, and cattle, these are the key commodities that drive deforestation. Commodities have a vast global impact, both socially and economically, and also environmentally. 70% of tropical deforestation is driven by soy, beef, and palm oil alone. Deforestation and forest degradation account for 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Forests cover 30% of our planet, but could completely disappear in 100 years at the current rate of deforestation from agricultural commodities. The practices used by farmers and others received have a major impact on the land under production. Let's take coffee in Peru, for example. In Peru, 400,000 people are related to the coffee production chain, and most of this coffee is produced on smallholder farms. These producers are in a situation of poverty, so boosting their production in a sustainable way helps to alleviate poverty and sustain livelihoods. Furthermore, the practices used by these farmers can have a huge impact on the status of the soil, on biodiversity in and off farm, and on basic ecosystem services. So agricultural commodities is a great place to start thinking about sustainable consumption and production. But where do we start? What exactly are agricultural commodities? Where do they come from? Who produces them? How are they produced? Your breakfast meal is a great way to start thinking about these questions. Who produced the milk, the coffee, the chocolate, the wheat, and the orange that you had for breakfast this morning, or whatever your breakfast choices might be? Your own breakfast plate provides a perfect lens to think about agricultural commodities. So why are your choices so important? We can think about both consumers and companies having a certain set of options, a certain set of choices. On the one hand, consumers face options such as buying local, organic, fairly traded products, free-range eggs, and specific company labels. Consumers can use existing labels to make responsible choices. At the same time, businesses also have options such as corporate social responsibility and environmental responsibility, and their own commitments, such as deforestation-free palm oil. Each product, each region, each country has a different situation and different causes for unsustainable production. The analysis of these causes is an essential step to go towards a more sustainable production, and certain tools for monitoring and tracking commodities and deforestation exist. Just a handful of these. Global Forest Watch looks at commodities, and it's a website where there's a lot of interesting and updated information about deforestation and deforestation maps. Trace is a system on transparency for sustainable economies, and this focuses on specific raw materials such as soy. The website shows the trajectory of the commodity from the producer to the consumer. Supplychange.org is another great website, and the Global Canopy Program Forest 500 is another. Others exist, such as ITERRA, that detects land cover changes resulting from human activities in near real time, producing updates every 16 days. It runs across all of Latin America. So there are tools to exist to help us monitor and map what's happening on the production side. One of the biggest challenges is awareness of both consumers and companies about the choices that they make and the impact that those choices have. It's important to think about how do we increase awareness of the potential impacts of unsustainable agricultural production, and these include deforestation and biodiversity loss, polluted waters and overuse of water, child labor, unfair labor laws, limited workers' rights, agricultural chemicals and contamination with associated health issues and also spillover into waterways, and unfair wages and practices that trap small producers in poverty and situations of food insecurity. If we understand these impacts, it helps us make better choices. Now let's look at the production side and some of the underlying causes of unsustainable commodity production. There are many issues to consider, and these include unclear land tenure, poor land use planning, policies and fiscal incentives that promote negative impacts, for example, policies that promote forest clearing or overharvest of fisheries, limited access to financial services, including credit, microcredit, low productivity because of outdated forest practices and farming practices, weak extension systems for small farmers in rural areas, and a lack of coordination by supply chain stakeholders. It's important to note that there are a number of labels that have been used to facilitate the choices of consumers, but many labels can be confusing. There's a movement right now for many companies to set targets so that within their operations, raw materials are produced in a sustainable manner. An example of this is the New York Declaration on Forests. This declaration was signed by countries, by private companies, and civil society actors pledging to reduce deforestation. There are also jurisdictional approaches, where multiple actors develop common standards on the sustainable management of raw materials in a specific area. This lowers costs because it allows a common protocol to be applied to a number of producers, while at the same time tracking them easily. It's clear that no single actor can address the complex set of issues alone. It's not easy to move from unsustainable production to sustainable production, and from unsustainable consumption to sustainable consumption. In fact, UNDP has identified many countries where there's little clarity on land tenure, making it very difficult to move towards sustainable production and consumption. Farmers can often hardly pay what's required to make changes in their productive systems to adapt to sustainable methods. There are many public policies that are not directly related to the sector, but can also affect production. For example, in many countries, comprehensive land use planning is lacking. But there are some examples of how public-private partnerships are showing the way forward. For example, there's a great case of collaboration between private companies and government, where Cocoa Life is a program from Mandela's that was implemented in cooperation with the national government in Ghana and the government of Dominican Republic for sustainable production of cacao. But to move forward, we need several things. We need government to take the lead in addressing the underlying national issues and to create an enabling environment for sustainable commodity sectors to grow and to flourish. There needs to be a financial incentive for sustainable production. There needs to be clear demand for sustainable commodities, and this needs to become the norm. And companies need to take their initiatives beyond their supply chains and to collaborate with governments at all sectoral levels. This is in part why UNDP has created the Green Commodities Program. The Green Commodities Program was launched in 2009, and its mission was to improve the national economic, social, and environmental performance of agricultural commodities. The goal is by 2020 to transform the agricultural sector in cattle, pineapple, fisheries, cocoa, soy, palm oil, and coffee. Through this program, UNDP hopes to work with 8 million farmers across 20 million hectares, ultimately benefiting more than 40 million people. UNDP's Green Commodity Program has pioneered what we call national commodity platforms. These platforms provide a neutral space that help convene multiple stakeholders to jointly agree on a national action plan, combining production and demand aspects and working across the entire system. The goal of a national commodity platform is to deliver multi-sectoral coordinated action for sustainable commodity production, and also to create an enabling environment for change. And this means changing policies that drive unsustainable production. These platforms are driven by participants, led by government, and enabled by the Global Commodities Program. These platforms provide effective and efficient implementation, and they foster national leadership on how to transform unsustainable practices to sustainable practices. These platforms work on systemic solutions to the root causes that underlie unsustainable production. Let me just give you one example on Costa Rica's pineapple industry. In Costa Rica, a national commodity platform was set up in 2011 to address concerns on the big pineapple boom that was driving deforestation. 900 people representing over 50 groups, including big buyers like Tesco and Walmart, and small-scale producers and civil society, were able to reach a consensus on the National Action Plan. This plan contains 12 activities that assign responsibilities to each stakeholder, and it addresses several issues, including agrochemical runoff into water sources, support for producers to improve their cultivation practices, and they develop financial incentives for sustainable production. To conclude, I'd like to thank you for your attention. The key points to remember from this short introduction to sustainable consumption and production are that first, as consumers, we all have choices, and those choices can have a big impact. Second, there are market tools such as labels and other forms of incentives that exist to help you make better choices and to help businesses and governments make better choices. Third, through collaborative action, such as UNDP's sustainable commodity platforms, we can take collaborative action to address these complex challenges systematically. And finally, we need to remember that often deeper structural changes are needed in order to be able to truly shift towards sustainable consumption and production patterns. To learn more, visit www.nbsapforum.org, nbsapforum.org. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.